The history of Apple has been written and filmed many times over, so I'm not here to give you the full story. But more often than not, modern retellings of Apple history usually go something like this. Wozniak, Jobs, garage. Stuff happens, yada yada yada, Macintosh. Jobs is fired. Then the earth cooled and the dinosaurs came. Jobs returns. iMac, iPod, iPhone, iPad. Jobs dies. The end. But let's rewind a bit, because these modern Jobs-centric histories gloss over what's easily the most important product and era in the company's history, and really in the entire industry's history, the Apple II. In fact, these days you're likely to hear the Lisa given as many lines in an average book or screenplay as the Apple II.
You know what Lisa stood for?
What?
The computer, the Lisa. You know what it stood for?
I'm talking about the Apple II, which is not just a crucial part of this company's history, it is a crucial part of the history of personal computing.
But the Lisa was always a footnote, a failed experiment that's now given extra weight because it was Steve Jobs' first pet project, and it has direct ties to the later Macintosh. The Apple II was a huge success with a 17-year run. In fact, it was the world's first successful personal computer, and it showed the way for literally every single machine that came after it. Apple got there with the brilliant and innovative scheme of backdoor marketing through schools. My junior high school and high school, like many schools across the U.S., were fully stocked with Apple II and II Plus machines, bought by the school district at a steep discount. Call it the McDonald's marketing plan, hook 'em while they're young. Kids like me would beg our parents for Apple IIs because we knew them, and our parents felt good buying them thinking that they'd help us with our schoolwork. An entire generation of Apple II users was created out of thin air in the early 1980s. The Apple II was primarily designed by Woz around a 1 MHz MOS 6502 CPU and originally came with 4K of RAM, a cassette interface, and BASIC in ROM. Fairly impressive specs for 1977, made all the more so by the fact that the II was a finished kit. Unlike most other computers of its time, including the earlier Apple I, it did not need assembly by the end user. These specs were augmented by 8 total expansion slots, a design idea still in practical use today, though ironically only in IBM PC-compatible desktops. But these slots were integral to the Apple II's success, just as Woz argued they would be, as they allowed new and even previously unknown peripherals like floppy and hard drives, modems, printers, 80-column cards, RAM upgrades, graphics and CPU accelerators, mice, game controllers, and more to be connected to the system, extending the life of both individual machines and the II line in general. Over the years, the II was upgraded several times, first to the II Plus with extra RAM and a revised BASIC, then to the IIe with even more RAM, the addition of lowercase characters, and a streamlined internal design to cut costs. The IIe alone remained on sale for 11 years, itself being upgraded to the IIe Enhanced and finally the IIe Platinum, with extra RAM yet again, revised cosmetics, a new keyboard, and an upgraded 65CO2 microprocessor that it shared with the more compact IIc. I'll have more on that machine later. But by the early 80s, the overall architecture of the system was really starting to show its age, with weak sound and graphics capabilities compared to even its 8-bit competitors. The Apple II had no dedicated graphics or sound hardware. It faked pretty much everything in software. With 16-bit systems from both Atari and Commodore's newly purchased Amiga division on the horizon that featured both impressive CPUs and separate graphics and sound hardware, Apple knew they needed a successor to the II. In fact, they knew it way back in 1980, but flubbed with the release of the business-oriented Apple III, which had a propensity to overheat and loosen the joints between the motherboard and various connected components, a problem Woz blamed squarely on Jobs' demand that the system have no fans. This led to Apple's most infamous support advice to end users ever: pick up your machine and drop it. Needless to say, this was Apple's first major failure and the III was discontinued, leaving the less powerful II line still on the market. Jobs and team lead John Couch then took a stab at a II successor with the Lisa, designed from the ground up around the same Motorola 68000 chip that would power the Amiga and Atari ST. It landed with a similar thud in 1983, though mostly due to its $10,000 price tag. By most accounts, the computer itself was elegant and innovative, though it did have a propensity for exploding batteries. The Lisa was the first Apple computer to ship with a graphical interface, an idea that the entire industry was convinced would be the future of computing. While Apple beat its main competitors to market, Amiga, Atari, IBM, and Microsoft were all working on similar graphical environments for their respective machines at around the same time. Apple needed a real, working solution fast, and not one that would cook itself to death or cost as much as a new car. By the early 80s, two competing visions at the company had taken hold. Woz, still leading the Apple II team, had been working on an upgraded 16-bit version of the II for years, and he finally found a design that provided both true 16-bit capability and full backward compatibility by utilizing a WDC65C816 CPU. This design could run almost all original Apple II software natively and at either normal or accelerated speed, while at the same time providing the power and memory addressing space required to run a 16-bit graphical environment. This computer would also have vastly upgraded graphics and sound capabilities. In fact, its Ensoniq ES5503 sound chip set the standard for years to come. Jobs, meanwhile, wanted a clean break. Some have argued that what he really wanted was to consolidate control of Apple, which he couldn't do as long as Woz's Apple II made all the money. Forced off the Lisa team after its disastrous debut, he turned to a fledgling project that had been stashed in the back rooms at Apple since 1979, the Macintosh. This project, initially led by Jeff Raskin, was intended to turn the home computer into an appliance, a simple, intuitive machine with power both unseen by and mostly inaccessible to the end user. Jobs drank the Kool-Aid on this concept and became its lead evangelist, believing it the successor to both the II-line and the Lisa and betting the future of the company on it, as well as his own. Now, it's worth pointing out here that despite his reputation for thinking different, Jobs was actually thinking very traditionally here. In the late 70s and early 80s, the common thing was you have a computer on the market for a few years, discontinue it, replace it with something completely different. Think about it. The Commodore VIC-20 was replaced by the C64, which was then replaced by the Amiga. The Atari 8-bit line, which actually had a similar run to the Apple II, was eventually replaced by the Atari ST. And so it would go for the Apple II, Jobs thought. It had been on the market for quite a few years at that point, and he thought that the company just needed something totally new. Now, Wozniak had a different idea, and his thinking was actually pretty innovative at the time. His thought was that you could keep upgrading a computer line basically indefinitely, as long as you kept it backward compatible, and that would let you continue building up a software library, a group of accessories that always worked with every system, and it would continue just growing your install base. This was unique thinking at the time. Really, nobody had tried this. IBM had not showed the way forward yet. They would later, but Apple could have done this first. Apple could have just kept extending the II-line forever, and that was what Wozniak wanted to try to do. But Jobs, for reasons that are really known only to him, wanted to stick with the traditional method of releasing an entirely new system every few years, and that's how we got the Macintosh. The Mac would be introduced before the new 16-bit Apple IIGS, but John Sculley, by then Apple's CEO, knew that the II-line would remain Apple's cash cow for at least the next few years. Initially, the Mac was positioned as kind of a low-end business machine, a cheaper and friendlier alternative to IBM's PC. With no color graphics and only rudimentary sound, it was actually the serious machine in Apple's lineup, albeit one designed to be less intimidating than IBM's monster PC to office managers worldwide. Woz's IIGS, the GS standing for graphics and sound, was initially positioned as the computer for everything the Mac wasn't: home entertainment, creativity, and education.
If you'd like to know what experts are saying about the new Apple IIGS, we'll translate.
It's got a 32-voice sound chip with digital synthesis.
256K on the motherboard with 1 meg expansion.
Hey, check out this RGB color with super high res.
Told ya, 16-bit processor, 2.8 meg clock speed.
The Apple IIGS.
Some machine, huh?
Simply speaking, the most powerful Apple II made.
But while the IIe had made some inroads in real business applications, that was now the realm of the Macintosh. Introduced in 1986, the IIGS initially outsold the Macintosh by a large amount, despite the power struggle within Apple that led to its CPU speed being artificially capped, just to keep it from cannibalizing Mac sales. Jobs did not want the IIGS to be too powerful, as it already had multimedia capabilities that far exceeded those of the Mac and would for years, as well as full backward compatibility and the expandability that the II-line had always been known for. In other words, it was a true continuation and clear successor to the 8-bit II-line, whereas the Macintosh was an all-new direction. In the end, Jobs got his way. Apple put most of its resources in the late 80s towards the Macintosh, and the 2GS was discontinued in 1992 with no upgraded model to take its place. Ironically, it was the 8-bit only 2E that stuck around until 1993, mostly as a low-cost option for those who needed to run older software. A 2E expansion card for Macintosh then served as a bridge between the two platforms until 1995, essentially putting a full-blown 2E inside a compatible Mac. But Apple saw the initially much more powerful 2GS as redundant in the face of the Mac, which by then was considered the future of the company. Now, I glossed over the 2C a bit, and that's because this was the first computer I ever owned, and I'm here to show it to you now. The 2C was released the same year as the Mac, and it has a similar computer as appliance design. No slots, what's in the box is what you get. But it was basically equivalent to a fully kitted 2E at the time, and it had all the ports you'd normally use the slots for in a 2E already. It also cost a lot less, which is why I ended up asking for one from my parents. I thought they could afford it, whereas the 2E was still a bit out of our price range. I never planned to use it for as long as I did, so I assumed I'd eventually just get a 2E anyway, or the rumored 2GS if it ever happened. Apple expected to sell 100,000 of these machines per month, but they actually sold that many in a year. The 2E continued to be the series' workhorse, which surprised the company and Jobs. Most people really did want expandability. I got my 2C in 1984, brand new, although there was no concept of computing history back then, so all I kept of my original packaging is the manual. And of course the monitor and computer itself. Both a bit horrifying to me in terms of condition. I try to take better care of my stuff these days. I know this is my machine because I actually etched the phone number of a girl I liked into it. Ah, kids. Incidentally, neither the computer nor the monitor have been exposed to really any sunlight ever, so all this yellowing you see was caused by heat in my attic just over the last 10 years. I used this machine continuously for over 8 years. Imagine still using an 8-bit Apple II as your primary computer in 1993. The keyboard, which was originally light, clicky, and comfortable to type on, is now gritty and heavy and worn out. Both the switches and the rubber mat underneath have made it impossible to type on over the years. Let's turn it on and see what happens. I periodically take this computer out of the attic to play some games, and last time I did, it was dead. There are various things I could look into fixing, but instead I used this as an excuse to get myself the machine I've always wanted, a 2GS. I do plan to revisit this later. It's my first computer and I do want to fix it. Maybe I'll make another video out of it. But here is my 2GS. It's a little yellowed too, and it has a cracked power receptacle and a scratched up monitor, but it works. My machine is a ROM 01, the second commercially released ROM revision. There was a ROM 00, and some of these have Wozniak's stamped signature on them, but these are not that rare, and that ROM's a little buggy. Mine came with the matching monitor, mouse and keyboard, and both dual 5¼ and 3.5-inch drives. This was the first Apple II that really supported 3.5-inch drives, and you really only need them for 16-bit 2GS specific software. Basically, this machine is as fully loaded as a 2GS back then typically could have been, although all 2GSs at the time came with a RAM upgrade card that could be populated with up to 1 megabyte, and mine only had the stock 256K. Now, I've made a couple of upgrades to the machine myself. First, I upgraded the RAM to 4 megabytes, more than most people would ever need on a 2GS, and way more than any software of the day would expect to see. There's still a cottage industry of people making new hardware for the 2GS, and RAM upgrades now come in both 4 and 8 meg varieties for not much money at all. I honestly have no idea what advantage 8 megs buys you over 4 megs, but 4 megs is really nice for running the GSOS, the 2GS's native graphical environment. With 256K, you can still run any 8-bit Apple II software and even a lot of 16-bit games that can boot from a floppy. But I had never been able to experience GSOS at the time, so I really wanted to try it out. I've also added a floppy EMU, which I'll be doing a separate video about. Many vintage computers now have devices like this that act as a floppy or hard disk emulator and allow you to run programs from SD card. A really handy blend of new and old technology. The Apple II actually has several different options for this, but I'm using the floppy EMU and I like it a lot. I don't really use my actual drives much at all anymore, although I do still have a lot of my own software on disk, and I do like the feel of actually putting a disk in a drive and hearing it spin occasionally. So let's fire up GSOS and take a look at what it can do. I'm actually going to boot from floppy because while it's entirely possible to run it from the floppy EMU, one of the limitations of the device is that you can't really use it alongside a real 3.5-inch drive due to the 2's daisy chaining rules. So installing software that you can use in GSOS once you've booted into it is kind of a pain, and requires the use of a PC running a program called Ciderpress and a lot of back and forth trial and error to get programs to run correctly. But booting off an actual floppy lets you just run whatever else you have on floppy. I'll explain all this in a little more detail when I do the floppy EMU video. It gets a little granular. Now, the 2GS uses 800K double density floppies, which are kind of an adventure in themselves. They're not easy to find anymore. There are a couple sites online where you can get new discs, but I bought mine on eBay. You just have to be careful and make sure you're actually getting 800K double density double-sided discs. I've just been writing and overwriting mine as I get new stuff to try out. I just have the 110 pack. To write a 2GS floppy disk, I use a program called ADT Pro that allows me to transfer data from my PC to the 2GS via a null modem cable. It runs as a server on PC and a client on the Apple II, and it'll write disk images to floppy that you keep stored on PC. I'll put some links to these things in the video description below. Now here we are in GSOS, which should look familiar to Mac users, especially early Mac users. It looks almost exactly the same as the original Mac OS and includes familiar features like the Finder, trash can, etc. The big difference between the original Mac OS and GSOS is that GSOS runs in color. It also runs pretty damn slowly, but that's because Jobs neutered the CPU. You can easily see how this could have progressed over time into the exact same operating system that the Mac OS became, but with full backward compatibility, Apple wouldn't have had to start completely over with all new software. There were accelerator cards available for the 2GS that make it faster than it was ever meant to be, but these are incredibly expensive even by modern standards. The best known of these is the Transwarp GS, but good luck finding one for less than $400. The last few I saw actually went for more than $500. To me that's just insane. I'd really love to have one of these to experiment with, but the whole point of running a machine like this these days is nostalgia and fun. It's not a race. But the Apple II market has really blown up over the last decade or so, and I'm just guessing it's the result of modern Apple fans with too much disposable income discovering Apple II stuff that they never experienced. So that's all the stuff the 2GS can do that was new to me when I got my system only a few years ago. But most of my Apple II software dates to the 1980s. Some of it I even wrote myself in computer science class. I still love to break out my old floppies every once in a while, most of which are horrendously mislabeled, and play what's really on this disk. I've found some real buried treasures in the last couple years, including Bank Street writer-based journal entries I wrote as a stupid, rebellious, angst-ridden teenager. Stuff I probably wanted to forget in my 20s, but that I'm happy to have back in my 40s. Here's a stack of either completely unlabeled or at least poorly labeled discs. Like everyone else in those days, I was terrible about labeling my discs, and often I would label, or at least write on the sleeves, and not on the labels themselves. Who knows what any of this means? I sure don't. But we're going to find out what's on some of these right now. Let's just take a look. Given the failure rate of 5.25-inch discs over a 35-year span, there's an element of Russian roulette involved every time I put a disc in the drive. Whenever I check another batch, the chances of hearing that awful Apple II disk error noise seem to be a bit higher. So I've been backing up my important stuff via ADT Pro. In case you're wondering, and I always did, that infamous and irritating noise is caused by Apple's drives forcing the heads to return back to the first track of the disk. Commodore and Atari both made drives that were really computers in their own right. They had built-in controllers with their own CPUs, and they knew where the drive head was on the disk. That's why they were so big and expensive. But Apple drives were dumb. This was a conscious decision by Steve Wozniak to keep the cost down and the size as small as possible. The computer controlled the drive, but it didn't know where the head actually was, only where it was commanded to be. So when there was an error, it would violently and repeatedly command the head back to the first track of the disk as a failsafe, resulting in that horrible noise. I do have a bunch of store-bought software too, some of which still works, and even a small collection of still-boxed games, including the original Leisure Suit Larry, the likewise original John Madden Football. Yes, it was an Apple II game before it appeared on any game console. the original test drive, and a couple of really interesting strategy games, which is a genre the Apple II excelled at in a way none of its competitors did. I was disappointed that my boxed copy of Ancient Art of War at Sea no longer worked the last time I tried it, but oh well, such is life with 5 1/4-inch discs. I've downloaded a replacement to SD card, but my boxed copy will never be complete again. So what can you still do with an Apple II? Well, technically you can still do all the things you originally could have. Run a BBS, or a D-Dial, an early chat room, or an AE-Wares site, or maintain a database, or word processing, or any number of other things.
It's a BBS.
The functions computers had at the time don't suddenly stop working, and believe it or not, there are still people doing all these things using Apple IIs across the country. You can even get an Apple II on the internet using Ethernet. But for most people, I think the real practical appeal of the Apple II these days, like any vintage computing system, is going to be its games. Now, I grew up with the Apple II, so I've grown to know and love its quirks and foibles. Where the C64 and Atari 8-bits would sing, the Apple II would be stuck with awkward beeps and bloops. Where those competitors would have big, beautiful sprites, the Apple II would have flickering, well, non-sprites. In most ways, if you're just looking for a retro computer to play games on, the Apple probably isn't the best choice. It did have the biggest software library by virtue of its popularity and longevity, so that's something, but nobody really has time to play 20,000 games anyway. If you're just looking for the best versions of the most popular games, you're probably not going to find them on the Apple II. I didn't want to admit that in 1986, but I can admit it now. But the Apple II has something that its competitors of the era don't, and that's a place in history as the basis for the success of a company the likes of which humankind has literally never seen. Apple is now the biggest technology company in the world, and that plain and simply would not have been possible without the Apple II. The Apple II made Apple all the money it took to keep the company afloat during the leanest of the Macintosh years. Those 17 years of success subsidized more than a decade of failure by the Mac, until Jobs was finally able to turn things around with the iMac and more notably the iPod. And that's something the Atari 8-bits and Commodore 64 just can't lay claim to. And honestly, there's just something about using a computer that you know had such an impact. I mean, there are people out there that collect iMacs, and hey, I don't judge anyone else's collection, but the iMac had basically no lasting impact on the industry. I mean, you don't see a lot of other manufacturers making Bondi blue transparent computers running the Mac OS these days, do you? But the Apple II is just, it's the computer. Whether it's an original 2, a 2 Plus, 2E, 2C, or 2GS, when you're using one, you can feel the way it defined an entire industry. And you can see its influence absolutely everywhere, in every little hardware design decision, and in all the software that you can run on it. Regardless of whether it was the most powerful system of its time, it wasn't. It just immediately feels like the definitive home computer of the 1970s and 1980s, in the same way the IBM PC was the definitive office computer of the same era. Well, the 1980s at least. The Apple II feels like it should have been just the start of something. Why didn't it do what the IBM PC did before the IBM PC did it? It should have and probably would have, if not for the hubris of one man who was frankly just too young and inexperienced to be making such decisions. But despite that, the Apple II lives on. It's greater than the sum of its parts, more than just a computer. It's something to be studied, thought about, taught in schools as both a case study in business success and a cautionary tale of how to squander it.